On the night of May 15th, 1970, the quiet campus of Jackson State University, a historically black college in Mississippi, was shattered in an instant. What should have been a normal evening for students, a time to study, relax, or share conversations with friends, suddenly turned into a scene of chaos and terror. Just past midnight, a volley of gunfire erupted, lasting only 30 seconds, yet leaving an impact that would resonate for decades. Students, many of them young and full of promise, found themselves trapped in a nightmare they could never have imagined. Their lives forever changed in the blink of an eye. Jackson State was more than just a university. It was a hub of learning, activism, and cultural vitality. Its students were not only pursuing education but also advocating for justice, equality, and a better future. The late 1960s and early 1970s were a time of intense social and political upheaval in the United States. Across the nation, young people were raising their voices against the Vietnam War and demanding civil rights for all. For the students at Jackson State, this meant that everyday life on campus was intertwined with the struggle for change, and tensions with local authorities were ever present. That night, tensions reached a breaking point. Police and highway patrol officers arrived on campus with weapons drawn, responding to reports of unrest. The specifics of what triggered the shooting remain complex, but what is clear is that the students were met with overwhelming force. Windows shattered, bullet holes scarred walls, and screams of fear echoed across the campus grounds. Those 30 seconds of gunfire created a scene reminiscent of a battlefield, a horrifying contrast to the peaceful pursuit of knowledge that had filled the campus just moments before. Amid the chaos, stories of bravery and survival emerged. Students dove for cover, pulled their friends to safety, and navigated the confusion with determination and courage. Tragically, some were not so fortunate. The names and faces of those who lost their lives, like Philip Lafayette Gibbs, a young pro-law student with a family on the way, remind us of the human cost of this dark chapter in history. Each life affected that night represents more than just a statistic. It represents dreams interrupted, families forever changed, and a community left to grapple with grief and anger. The events of May 15th, 1970, serve as a powerful reminder of the importance of understanding history, confronting injustice, and valuing the voices of young people advocating for change. As we explore this story, we honor the courage of those who lived through it and reflect on the lessons it offers for our society today. By remembering these events, we ensure that the struggles and sacrifices of the students at Jackson State are never forgotten. If you want to dive deeper into the story, learn more about the historical context, and hear first-hand accounts from survivors, make sure to like this video, subscribe to our channel, and turn on notifications so you never miss a story that matters. Together, we can keep history alive, learn from the past, and inspire a future where justice and equality are more than just ideals, they are a reality. As the first flashes of gunfire lit up the campus of Jackson State University, the night transformed from a tense but familiar protest into a moment of unimaginable horror. A chaos that would forever mark the lives of everyone present. Students who had gathered to exercise their right to speak out, to demand justice, to assert their humanity in a world that had often denied it, suddenly found themselves caught in a violent storm, one they could neither predict nor control. The sound of bullets tearing through the air, ricocheting off brick and glass, mingled with the terrified cries of young men and women scrambling for safety, creating a scene that was at once surreal and horrifyingly real. In those first moments, confusion reigned supreme. It was impossible to discern direction, to understand who was safe, or to know where the next impact might strike. What began as a protest, a gathering of minds and hearts seeking change, became a battlefield overnight, each step and each movement a matter of survival. Among the chaos, Philip Lafayette Gibbs, a 21-year-old pre-law student with a wife and a child on the way, moved through the campus with the same hope and determination that had characterized his life until that fateful night. Gibbs was more than a student. He embodied the aspirations of a generation determined to challenge the injustices that had shaped their reality. And he carried within him the ordinary dreams of any young person stepping into adulthood and education. A family, a future filled with possibilities. Yet as the gunfire erupted, those dreams were abruptly shattered. In the span of seconds, the life of a young man full of promise was cut short, leaving behind grieving family, stunned friends, and a campus reeling from the sudden and devastating loss. The impact of his death was immediate and palpable, a stark reminder that the stakes of activism in 1970 Mississippi were sometimes measured in human life, and that courage, while necessary, could not always shield one from tragedy. Dozens of other students experienced injuries in that terrifying moment, each wound telling its own story of fear, confusion, and desperate attempts to survive. Some were struck by bullets as they sought refuge behind doors or walls, while others were trampled in the frantic rush to escape. The dormitories, which had once offered a sense of safety and community, were transformed into shelters of chaos and horror. Windows shattered, walls pocked with the marks of gunfire, and hallways filled with the groans and cries of the wounded. Each student faced the terrifying immediacy of danger, often separated from friends and peers, forced to navigate a landscape where every sound and every movement carried the threat of further harm. The sheer intensity of the moment left many traumatized, a psychological imprint that would linger long after the physical wounds had begun to heal. As the night wore on and the gunfire ceased, the campus lay in stunned silence, a silence heavy with the weight of loss and the shock of survival. The names of the fallen were whispered among students and faculty, not merely as a recounting of events, but as a solemn acknowledgement of the lives taken and the futures denied. Philip Lafayette Gibbs' death became a symbol, a touchstone for reflection on the systemic injustices that permeated the society surrounding Jackson State. A reminder that the struggle for equality was fraught with real and sometimes deadly consequences. Yet alongside grief, there was a growing sense of unity among those who had survived, a recognition that the courage displayed on that night, even in the face of unimaginable danger, was not in vain, and that their voices, now even more urgent, would carry forward the demands for justice and recognition that had sparked their protest in the first place. The chaos of that night was not limited to the immediate physical impact. It extended into the emotional and cultural fabric of the university and the wider community. Families were left to grapple with sudden, incomprehensible loss. The students who had been injured faced long recoveries both physically and mentally. And the campus itself bore the scars of violence that would remain visible for years to come. Yet in the midst of tragedy, the resilience of the Jackson State community shone through. Students who had witnessed the horrors banded together, offering support to the wounded, comforting each other in their grief, and documenting the events so that the truth would not be lost amidst the chaos and confusion. These acts of solidarity underscored the strength of a community that, despite facing systemic oppression and direct violence, refused to be silenced or diminished. In recounting the deaths and injuries of that night, it is impossible to separate the personal from the political, the individual from the collective. Each injury, each loss, was entwined with the broader narrative of racial injustice, the ongoing struggle for civil rights, and the climate of unrest that defined much of America during this period. The students of Jackson State were not merely passive victims. They were active participants in a movement for change, a generation willing to confront inequality despite the dangers inherent in doing so. The tragedy of May 15, 1970, serves both as a solemn reminder of the risks faced by those who challenge entrenched systems of power, and as a testament to the courage and determination of young people willing to stand up for justice. even in the face of overwhelming adversity. Even decades later, the memory of that night continues to resonate, shaping how we understand student activism, state violence, and the broader struggle for equality in America. The stories of the injured, of those who ran for their lives, and of those who lost friends or family, remain central to the narrative of Jackson State University and the civil rights movement as a whole. By remembering Philip Lafayette Gibbs and his peers, we do more than honor their lives. We confront the harsh realities of history, learn from the mistakes and injustices of the past, and reaffirm our commitment to creating a society where young people can raise their voices without fear, where education and activism coexist with safety, and where the sacrifices of those who came before us continue to inspire action and change. The sound of gunfire that night at Jackson State University was deafening, a relentless cascade of violence that shattered the calm of the campus and sent waves of panic through every corner of the grounds. Over 460 rounds were fired by local and state police, each shot embedding itself in brick and glass, leaving scars that would remain long after the echoes faded. The dormitories, once symbols of student life and community, became haphazard shelters under siege, windows exploding outward, walls marked by the imprints of bullets, and hallways transformed into corridors of fear. Students dove to the floor, clinging to one another, pulling friends and classmates to safety while the barrage continued, the trajectory of each round unpredictable, each impact a potential tragedy in itself. The chaos was compounded by the sheer density of fire. In 30 seconds, the campus had been transformed into a scene that resembled a battlefield more than a university. The violence indiscriminate and terrifying in its scope. Inside the dormitories, the situation was surreal and horrifying. Students pressed against walls and furniture, trying to shield themselves as shards of glass and fragments of masonry rained down. Some were struck directly, suffering injuries from buckshot or bullet fragments, while others were injured simply by the crush of fellow students attempting to escape. The noise of gunfire mixed with screams and shouts, creating an almost unbearable cacophony that made it impossible to think clearly or coordinate an escape. Every moment stretched into an eternity, each second carrying the weight of life or death. And yet amidst the panic, instinct and courage guided many to survive. Students dragged the injured into stairwells, through broken doors, and under the relative safety of hallways, attempting to preserve life while the chaos around them intensified. The visual and emotional impact of the police response cannot be overstated. The dormitories were transformed from spaces of study, rest, and friendship into a testament to the force wielded against unarmed youth. Their walls pocked with hundreds of bullet marks, each one a reminder of the fragility of life and the immediacy of danger. Windows shattered in spectacular patterns, glass glittering on the floors and in the grass outside, reflecting the chaos and panic that had overtaken the campus. Students, many of them young and untested in such extreme circumstances, were forced to confront violence in its rawest form, their bodies and minds absorbing trauma that would persist long after the night ended. The sheer scale of firepower used, hundreds of rounds in mere seconds, left little room for doubt about the magnitude of the threat faced by the students and the overwhelming imbalance of power in the confrontation. Amid this storm, stories of individual courage and survival emerged, each one a testament to human resilience. Some students dove through broken windows to escape the rooms being hit, feeling shards of glass cut through their clothing and skin, yet continuing forward, propelled by the need to survive. Others pulled friends from the line of fire, lifting injured bodies into stairwells or behind makeshift barricades, acting instinctively to preserve life in the face of chaos. Even in those moments of terror, the bonds between students revealed themselves, as classmates prioritized each other's safety over their own, creating small pockets of solidarity in a landscape dominated by fear. It was in these acts of quiet heroism that the human story of that night persisted, not merely as a record of violence, but as a chronicle of courage and determination under circumstances that tested the limits of endurance. The architectural layout of the campus intensified the effects of the shooting. Hallways, stairwells, and dormitory entrances became sites of both refuge and peril. Students navigating these spaces faced the dual challenge of evading gunfire while simultaneously attempting to help others, a task that demanded both speed and careful judgment. The bullets that tore through walls and doors transformed ordinary structures into unpredictable hazards, while the sheer volume of rounds fired ensured that the threat was ever present, and no location could be considered truly safe. The experience of the students, caught between the need to escape and the desire to assist peers, became a harrowing test of courage, resilience, and the will to survive. Beyond the physical damage, the psychological impact was profound. The immediate trauma of the barrage was compounded by a sense of helplessness and fear that pervaded the campus long after the last shot was fired. Students who had been injured, those who had witnessed the deaths and injuries of friends, and even those who had found relative safety, were forced to process the horror of an event that defied ordinary understanding. The sounds, the sights, and the abruptness of the violence left indelible impressions on the minds of all who were present. The campus, once a place of learning and community, became a symbol of vulnerability. The memory of that night a haunting reminder of how swiftly and unpredictably life could be altered by acts of aggression. In reflecting on the use of such overwhelming force, it becomes clear that the events at Jackson State University were more than an isolated incident. They were a reflection of broader social tensions, a convergence of historical, political, and racial pressures that erupted with devastating consequences. The indiscriminate nature of the gunfire underscored the vulnerability of the students and highlighted the imbalance of power in a society where young people advocating for justice could be met with lethal force. The damage to property, the physical injuries, and the emotional scars combined to create a narrative that was at once horrifying and instructive, a stark lesson in the consequences of unchecked authority and the urgent need for accountability and reform. Even decades later, the images of shattered dormitories, scarred walls, and the terrified faces of students persist as powerful reminders of that night. The over 460 rounds fired by police did not merely strike walls or windows. They struck the very heart of a community committed to learning, justice, and change, leaving a legacy that continues to inform conversations about civil rights, student activism, and the responsibilities of those entrusted with enforcing the law. The events of May 15, 1970, remain a critical chapter in the story of Jackson State University, a moment when the courage, resilience, and determination of students were tested under extraordinary circumstances, and when the consequences of state violence were made painfully, tragically, clear to all who bore witness. The students who gathered on the campus of Jackson State University in the spring of 1970 were not simply restless youth. They were a generation deeply aware of the injustices surrounding them. A generation whose lives had been shaped by the persistent weight of racial discrimination and the relentless presence of societal inequities. The call to protest was rooted in a combination of deeply personal and broadly political grievances, each one intertwined with the other, creating a tapestry of motivation that reflected both the immediate struggles of the community and the larger currents sweeping across the nation. For these students, every day at Jackson State was a negotiation with a society that had long marginalized African Americans, and their activism was both an assertion of dignity and a demand for recognition, a refusal to remain invisible in a world that had too often overlooked them. Racial harassment was a constant reality in Jackson, Mississippi, a city whose streets and public spaces were frequently battlegrounds for the assertion of supremacy and control by those who felt threatened by the assertion of equality. Students recounted being taunted, insulted, and intimidated as they moved through town, verbal assaults and outright hostility greeting them even in places they should have considered safe. This constant barrage of disrespect and danger created an environment in which the simple act of walking through the streets, attending classes, or gathering with friends was infused with tension and vigilance. Each encounter with harassment reinforced the necessity of speaking out, of challenging the status quo, and of refusing to accept a social order built on the systematic oppression of their community. The protests that unfolded at Jackson State were, therefore, more than reactions to singular incidents. They were responses to a pervasive, everyday reality that demanded attention and redress. Segregation, still deeply embedded in the social fabric of Mississippi, provided another powerful impetus for student activism. In 1970, despite the legal advances of the civil rights movement, the shadow of Jim Crow laws lingered, shaping everything from educational opportunities to public accommodations and even routine interactions on campus. Students were acutely aware of the disparities, and their protests were an expression of frustration and impatience with a system that had promised equality but delivered far too little. The presence of segregation in daily life, whether in subtle gestures of exclusion or overt acts of discrimination, reinforced the urgency of their activism, making the campus a microcosm of the broader struggle for civil rights. The very act of protesting, of gathering publicly to demand justice and recognition, was an affirmation of their humanity and a refusal to accept the limitations imposed upon them by a society still struggling with the legacy of racial oppression. Layered atop these immediate concerns was the broader political context of the Vietnam War, a conflict that had come to dominate national consciousness and deeply affect the young people of the country. Students at Jackson State, like their peers across the United States, were attuned to the human cost of the war, the lives lost in a conflict that seemed increasingly distant from their daily reality, yet inescapably connected to their society through conscription. Media coverage and political debate. The war became a symbol of a government willing to expend human life without adequate justification, a source of moral outrage that intersected with the domestic injustices of segregation and racial harassment. Protesting against the war was, therefore, not merely an abstract political statement. It was a continuation of the demand for justice, a refusal to allow the same disregard for human life abroad to mirror the systemic disregard for African Americans at home. In this way, the anti-war stance of the students was deeply entwined with their fight for racial equality, creating a unified front that challenged both local and national structures of power. The protests at Jackson State were vivid, immediate, and highly personal. Students marched, chanted, and occupied key areas of the campus, their presence a physical manifestation of their demands for recognition and change. They carried with them the weight of history, the murders of civil rights leaders, the ongoing struggle for equality, and the collective memory of a community that had endured centuries of oppression. Each demonstration was not just a performance of defiance but an act of survival, a way to assert control over spaces that society often treated as hostile, and to claim visibility in a world that had too often rendered them invisible. Their voices, rising in unison, expressed both anger and hope, refusal to remain silent despite the risks, and an insistence that their experiences and demands be acknowledged. This confluence of factors, racial harassment, segregation, and opposition to the Vietnam War, created an atmosphere of tension and urgency on the Jackson State campus. Students were not merely reacting spontaneously. They were responding to a complex web of injustices that had accumulated over years, a combination of systemic oppression and immediate threats that demanded action. Their protests were both a call for protection and a demand for recognition, a declaration that they would not tolerate a world in which their rights, their dignity, and their lives could be so easily disregarded. The energy and determination of these students reflected the broader movements of the era, connecting the local struggles of Jackson State to the national narrative of civil rights and anti-war activism, and placing the events of that night within a larger continuum of social change. Even as the students stood on Lynch Street, chanting slogans and asserting their rights, the atmosphere was charged with both hope and danger, the convergence of courage and vulnerability creating a moment of profound significance. The presence of state and local police, the heavy-handed responses, and the eventual outbreak of violence underscored the risks inherent in standing up to entrenched systems of power, yet also highlighted the moral imperative that drove the students to act. Their protests were not acts of recklessness, but deliberate, reasoned attempts to claim justice, safety, and equality in a world that had long denied them these basic rights. The night of May 15th, 1970, would ultimately become a turning point, a tragic but defining moment that reflected the broader struggles of a generation unwilling to accept injustice, and whose courage and resilience continue to resonate as a testament to the enduring fight for human dignity and equality in the face of adversity. The events at Jackson State University on May 15, 1970, did not occur in isolation. They were part of a larger, turbulent moment in American history, a period defined by unrest, activism, and profound societal tension that stretched from coast to coast. Just days earlier, the nation had been shaken by the shootings at Kent State University in Oyo, where National Guardsmen had opened fire on unarmed students protesting the invasion of Cambodia, killing 4 and wounding 9 others. The news of Kent State traveled swiftly, carried by television broadcasts, newspapers, and word of mouth, reaching college campuses everywhere and igniting both outrage and fear. For students at Jackson State, the Kent State tragedy was a stark and visceral warning of the potential consequences of speaking out. Yet it did not deter them. If anything, it galvanized their determination, reinforcing the urgency of their own struggle for justice and equality, both on campus and within the broader societal framework of Mississippi, a state still grappling with the entrenched legacies of segregation and racial oppression. The juxtaposition of national anti-war protests with local civil rights struggles created a unique and combustible atmosphere on campuses like Jackson State, where students were not only concerned with distant military conflicts but also with the immediate, tangible realities of their daily lives. Each student carried the weight of personal experience alongside a broader political consciousness. Understanding that the fight for civil rights and the opposition to the war were intertwined, battles against injustice in different forms. The memory of Martin Luther King Jr.'s assassination just 2 years prior still lingered, a stark reminder of the high cost of advocating for racial equality, and his absence was felt as both a loss and a call to action. Students at Jackson State, aware of both the local racial dynamics and the national climate of dissent, recognized that their protests were not merely expressions of frustration but essential statements of identity, humanity, and moral responsibility in a society that had long denied them equal treatment. As the campus prepared for demonstrations, the shadow of Kent State loomed large over the students' minds. There was an acute awareness that the armed forces and law enforcement could, and indeed had, respond with lethal force to peaceful protests. This awareness heightened both the anxiety and the resolve of the students, compelling them to carefully consider the logistics of their actions, to communicate and organize, and to hold fast to the principle that their voices mattered even in the face of danger. The convergence of anti-war sentiment and civil rights advocacy made Jackson State a microcosm of national unrest, illustrating how interconnected struggles for justice could amplify tensions, particularly in regions where racial divisions remained rigid and often violently enforced. It was in this context that the events of May 15th unfolded, a tragic collision of youthful activism, institutional authority, and a societal moment defined by fear, resistance, and profound moral stakes. The tension on campus was palpable in the days leading up to the shootings. Students gathered in small groups, discussing news from other campuses, sharing concerns about local harassment, and strategizing about how to make their voices heard without endangering one another. Conversations frequently returned to Kent State, with students analyzing what had gone wrong, wondering whether the same fate might await them, and considering how to assert their rights safely yet forcefully. The discussions revealed a sophisticated awareness of power dynamics, an understanding that their activism was not abstract but situated within a network of historical, political, and social forces that could react with unpredictable and often violent consequences. The protests were planned not out of recklessness, but out of a profound sense of duty to resist oppression and assert dignity, a refusal to allow fear to silence demands for justice. On the night of May 14th, the campus felt charged with a mixture of anticipation, anxiety, and determination. Students gathered in small groups along Lynch Street and other central areas, their voices rising in chants demanding equality and an end to U.S. military aggression abroad. There was laughter and nervous joking, a human attempt to maintain morale in the face of uncertainty. But beneath it lay a deep, shared understanding of risk. The memory of Kent State was alive in their minds, each student acutely aware of the potential for escalation, yet driven by a sense of collective purpose and moral urgency that outweighed the instinct for self-preservation. As the night wore on, the crowd grew larger, the chants louder, and the presence of local and state police became increasingly intimidating, a visible reminder of the authority that could, as history had shown, be wielded with deadly consequences. The morning of May 15th arrived with a tension that seemed almost tangible. The students, having spent the night discussing, planning, and preparing, were determined to make their protest visible, to assert that the injustices they faced, racial harassment, segregation, and the broader political discontent surrounding the Vietnam War would not be ignored. They marched, chanted, and occupied key areas of the campus with a sense of purpose that was both inspiring and precarious, their actions echoing the growing national dialogue on civil rights and anti-war activism. Each step, each raised voice, was an act of courage in a climate where the very act of protest could invite lethal force. And yet the students proceeded, embodying both defense and hope. Their presence was a testament to the interconnectedness of national and local struggles, illustrating how a small campus in Mississippi was bound to larger movements shaping the country and the consciousness of a generation unwilling to remain passive in the face of injustice. Even as police presence increased, students sought to maintain a peaceful stance, mindful of the events at Kent State yet undeterred in their commitment to advocacy. Their chants were deliberate, aimed at articulating grievances and demanding accountability, yet the environment around them remained charged, unpredictable, and potentially dangerous. It was this fragile balance between the urgency of protest and the threat of violence that defined the moments leading up to the shooting, a convergence of historical memory, political consciousness, and the lived realities of racial oppression. The night of May 15th, 1970, would become a defining episode in this context, a tragic reminder of the costs of activism and the perils faced by those who dared to challenge entrenched systems of power, and yet also a testament to the courage and moral clarity of the students whose voices could not be silenced even by fear. Jackson State University, as a historically black institution, had long been more than just a place of learning. It was a crucible for activism, a site where young minds were not only educated but also politicized, sharpened by both the legacies of oppression and the ongoing fight for justice, and imbued with a sense of responsibility to challenge societal inequities wherever they manifested. The campus was alive with discourse and engagement, a hub where students debated, organized, and planned actions designed to assert their dignity and demand recognition of their rights. But this vibrancy did not exist in isolation. It clashed continuously with a surrounding society that remained deeply hostile, particularly in the streets beyond the campus boundaries, where the presence of white motorists often transformed ordinary daily life into a landscape fraught with tension and potential danger. For many students, traversing these streets was a test of both courage and composure, as verbal assaults, racial slurs, and outright harassment were a regular and expected part of the day, an omnipresent reminder that the world beyond campus did not recognize or respect their humanity. This environment of hostility, ever present and inescapable, shaped the student body's perception of justice and safety, reinforcing the necessity of self-advocacy and community solidarity, and highlighting the ways in which systemic discrimination could seep into even the most mundane interactions, turning routine movements into potentially charged encounters with aggression. Within this context, the activism at Jackson State became an expression not just of political opinion but of survival and identity, a deliberate assertion that the students' voices, experiences, and lives mattered in a society that had historically sought to marginalize them. The streets bordering the campus, particularly Lynch Street, became a stage where tensions between students and white motorists frequently erupted, and even minor provocations could escalate into confrontations. White drivers, often emboldened by the racial hierarchies maintained in Mississippi, would jeer, hurl insults, or throw objects, behaviors that were not merely acts of casual aggression but deliberate efforts to intimidate and assert dominance over a population whose presence challenged long-standing social norms. These interactions, repeated and unrelenting, created a simmering atmosphere in which the line between everyday harassment and broader systemic injustice blurred, producing an environment ripe for protest, where students felt compelled to respond not only to isolated incidents, but to the broader pattern of oppression that those incidents represented. The history of Jackson State as a site of activism thus intersected with the immediate realities of racial hostility, creating a unique environment in which the students' engagement with social issues was both intellectually informed and viscerally felt, a combination that lent urgency and intensity to their demonstrations. The university had cultivated generations of students who were not merely academically accomplished, but also politically aware, attuned to both the national and local currents shaping their world. Many had grown up hearing stories of segregation, systemic inequality, and the courage of civil rights activists who had risked everything to demand justice. And those lessons were embedded in the culture of the campus, informing both discourse and action, within the classrooms, in the dormitories, and across the campus grounds. Students discussed strategies for advocacy, debated the ethics of protest, and examined the history of resistance that had come before them, recognizing that their efforts were part of a continuum stretching from the civil rights struggles of the 1950s and 1960s to the anti-war movements that were sweeping the nation. This historical consciousness created a dual lens through which students understood both the verbal harassment and physical intimidation they faced, and the broader political stakes of their activism, fostering a sense of purpose and moral clarity that was inseparable from the lived experience of confronting injustice daily. The presence of white motorists, often hostile and provocative, became a daily reminder that the struggle for justice extended beyond abstract ideals into tangible, immediate dangers. Students would recount incidents in which cars sped through the campus, shouting slurs, in some cases, attempting to intimidate groups of young people simply for existing in a shared public space. And these encounters were not isolated but emblematic of the broader societal tensions that defined Jackson in 1970. Each confrontation, whether verbal or physical, reinforced the need for collective action, demonstrating that the assertion of dignity and equality could not be left to chance or individual effort but required organized, sustained advocacy. a fact that infused the campus with a heightened sense of purpose. Amid these dynamics, the activism of Jackson State students was characterized by both courage and strategy. As they navigated an environment where the boundaries between protest and confrontation were often perilously thin, the combination of local hostility, the ongoing civil rights struggle, and the backdrop of nationwide anti-war sentiment created an intense, almost combustible atmosphere, one in which the students' determination to assert their rights was both necessary and dangerous. It was within this charged setting that the events of May 15, 1970, unfolded, as the students' long-standing commitment to challenging injustice collided with the reality of armed authority, a tragic intersection of courage, oppression, and the unrelenting pursuit of justice that would leave an indelible mark on the history of Jackson State University and the broader narrative of activism in America. In the days leading up to the tragedy of May 15, 1970, the Jackson State University campus had become a simmering crucible of tension, where the everyday realities of life under systemic oppression collided with the passionate determination of a generation unwilling to remain silent. And the incidents that unfolded in the streets surrounding the university were both a reflection and a catalyst of the heightened anxieties that would soon explode into violence. Rocks and bricks thrown at passing cars, a tactic born of frustration and desperation, were more than mere acts of defiance. They were symbolic gestures of resistance, an attempt by students to assert agency in a world that consistently denied them both recognition and safety. And while these acts might be interpreted by some as reckless, they were in fact rooted in the continuous cycle of harassment and intimidation the students endured daily. White motorists, many of whom drove through the campus as if it were their personal domain, hurled verbal insults, shouted racial epithets, and in some instances escalated confrontations with provocative gestures or attempts at intimidation, forcing students to navigate a volatile environment where even crossing a street could invite humiliation or physical threat. The students' responses, while at times visible and dramatic, must be understood in the context of a community under siege, where the very act of existing as young Black Americans in a city defined by entrenched racial hierarchies carried inherent risk and demanded both courage and creativity in asserting one's dignity and humanity. These confrontations were not isolated incidents, but part of a broader pattern in which the campus and its surrounding areas became a microcosm of the national struggle for civil rights and social justice. A vivid illustration of how localized acts of resistance intersected with the larger anti-war and civil rights movements sweeping across the country. Each rock thrown, each shouted retort, each challenge to the authority of passing motorists was embedded within a historical consciousness, a recognition that students were continuing a struggle that had spanned generations. From the sit-ins and freedom rides of the early 1960s to the emergent anti-war demonstrations in which young people nationwide were questioning the moral and political legitimacy of U.S. involvement in Vietnam. For students at Jackson State, these acts were not impulsive outbursts but deliberate assertions of presence, a declaration that they would not be rendered invisible or silenced. And they were framed by an understanding of both personal and collective stakes. Every confrontation was a negotiation of power, a test of how far they could push back against systemic injustice while navigating the precarious boundary between protest and potential reprisal. The interactions between students and law enforcement in these moments added another layer of tension, as police presence was both omnipresent and menacing, serving as a constant reminder that the assertion of rights could quickly escalate into deadly consequences. Officers patrolled the streets with a visible and heavily armed presence, observing, intervening, and, in some instances, directly confronting students who resisted or challenged the societal norms enforced by the white-dominated local authorities. Verbal exchanges between students and police often began with warnings, commands to disperse, or admonitions against disorderly conduct. But the undercurrent of fear and frustration permeated each encounter, creating a charged atmosphere in which the potential for escalation was ever present. Students, aware of the violent potential, nonetheless pressed forward, their activism informed by both historical memory and an acute awareness of the injustices that surrounded them, and their determination transformed each interaction into an act of moral and political significance. A visible challenge to the structures of authority that had long sought to suppress them. As these confrontations escalated, the rhythm of campus life itself seemed to vibrate with tension, with each incident reinforcing a sense of urgency and shared purpose among the student body. Groups would gather at key intersections, organizing and strategizing, while others moved along Lynch Street and other main thoroughfares, seeking to maintain visibility and voice in the public sphere even as they navigated the risks posed by aggressive motorists and law enforcement. The act of throwing rocks or bricks was never mindless. It was calculated, reactive, and symbolic, a response to cumulative provocations and a statement of agency in a society that systematically sought to deny it. Likewise, verbal confrontations, while sometimes heated or seemingly spontaneous, were part of a broader dialogue about respect, recognition, and power, a negotiation that demanded both assertiveness and strategy. And in this way, every small incident contributed to the larger narrative of student activism on campus, creating a backdrop of escalating tension that made the eventual tragedy all the more devastating and historically significant. The persistent harassment and the confrontational tactics employed by students created a feedback loop, in which each new provocation intensified the existing tensions, raising the stakes for both sides, as police forces grew more visible and vigilant, responding to both real and perceived threats. The sense of unpredictability and danger increased, and students were forced to continuously assess the risks of their actions while remaining committed to their principles. This interplay of activism, harassment, and law enforcement response underscored the precariousness of life on the Jackson State campus at that moment, revealing how systemic inequality, racial hostility, and political unrest converged in a way that made ordinary interactions fraught with peril. Each rock thrown, each insult exchanged, each confrontation with the police carried the weight of history and consequence, reflecting the broader social and political dynamics that would culminate in the violent events of May 15th and leaving an indelible impression on the collective memory of the university and the nation at large. Even as these confrontations unfolded, students maintained a remarkable sense of cohesion and purpose, recognizing that their struggle was both immediate and symbolic, personal and political. The rocks, the bricks, the verbal justs, and the escalating confrontations were all part of a complex tapestry of resistance, in which the assertion of dignity and rights intersected with the lived experience of fear, anger, and courage. This pattern of interaction, repeated and intensifying, ultimately framed the context in which law enforcement would later unleash a devastating barrage of gunfire, illustrating the tragic consequences of miscommunication, systemic prejudice, and the fraught dynamics of protest in an era defined by both national and local upheaval. The incidents on the streets, therefore, must be understood not merely as acts of disorder, but as part of a sustained and meaningful struggle, one that highlighted the resilience, determination, and humanity of the students even in the face of extraordinary danger and injustice. As the chaos of that night at Jackson State University unfolded, the reality of the violence soon became tragically clear, leaving a landscape marked not only by physical destruction but also by profound psychological scars that would linger for decades. The dormitories, which had once served as safe havens for students seeking education, camaraderie, and refuge, were suddenly transformed into scenes of devastation. their walls riddled with bullets from an overwhelming fusillade that had erupted in mere moments, turning spaces meant for rest and study into harrowing reminders of vulnerability and fear. Each shattered window and each dented wall carried a story of survival and loss, marking the spaces where students had huddled, run, or fallen, and bearing witness to the indiscriminate nature of the violence that had been unleashed upon them. The hallways and rooms, once filled with the sounds of daily campus life, now echoed with the aftermath of trauma, the silence punctuated only by the cries of the injured, the shattering of glass, and the urgent footsteps of those attempting to aid their friends, neighbors, and classmates in the immediate chaos. In these moments, the abstract horrors of systemic oppression and unchecked authority became tragically concrete, as students confronted the immediate and devastating consequences of a society in which their lives were too easily disregarded. Among the students, the impact of that night extended far beyond the physical injuries sustained from bullets or being trampled in the panic. It reached into the core of their emotional and psychological well-being, creating a collective trauma that would shape the university community for years to come. Many who survived the gunfire carried with them vivid memories of narrowly escaping death, the searing heat of projectiles striking walls, floors, and personal belongings around them, and the disorienting noise that seemed to come from every direction, a relentless cascade of sound and fear that left no room for rational thought or calm. The experience of being hunted in one's own space, of seeing classmates struck down or wounded, created a lasting imprint on the student's sense of security, trust, and place within the world, reinforcing the fragile nature of safety for those already marginalized by racial injustice and societal neglect. The dormitories, previously spaces of community and solidarity, became reminders of how quickly ordinary life could be shattered by the eruption of violence. And each scar etched into the building's walls symbolized not only the physical assault on the students, but also the broader assault on their sense of dignity and belonging. The indiscriminate nature of the attack, in which hundreds of rounds were fired at students without distinction, underscored the extreme imbalance of power and the absence of accountability, creating a sense of injustice that compounded the trauma. Students who had gathered to express their frustrations, to demand respect and equality, found themselves facing a level of force that was both overwhelming and wholly disproportionate to any perceived threat. And the aftermath of that night revealed the stark reality of systemic impunity. Despite the documented evidence of injuries, deaths, and widespread destruction, no police officers were held accountable, and the absence of justice left the community grappling with a sense of betrayal and unresolved grievance. Further entrenching the narrative of oppression and the historical context in which the violence occurred, the lack of accountability sent a chilling message, reinforcing the notion that the structures of authority were often aligned against those who dared to challenge societal norms, and that the costs of asserting one's rights could be met with lethal consequences without recourse or redress. In the days and weeks following the incident, the impact of the violence continued to resonate across campus, shaping the collective consciousness of students, faculty, and the broader community. Counseling and support were often limited, and many students struggled privately with the aftereffects, attempting to reconcile their experiences with a society that had allowed such an atrocity to occur. The dormitories, marked with bullet holes and structural damage, served as both physical and symbolic reminders of that night, illustrating the tangible consequences of unchecked aggression and the vulnerability of communities that existed under the shadow of systemic racism. Alumni and faculty who had witnessed the events grappled with a profound sense of loss and the challenge of guiding students through both mourning and recovery, all while ensuring that the spirit of activism and the pursuit of justice remained alive despite the trauma inflicted upon the campus. The deaths of Philip Lafayette Gibbs and James Earl Green, coupled with the injuries and psychological harm suffered by dozens more, highlighted the human cost of a confrontation that had escalated far beyond reason, leaving an indelible mark on the history of Jackson State University and the collective memory of the civil rights era. Survivors carried with them stories of bravery and survival, narratives that intertwined personal courage with broader social significance, and these stories became crucial elements in preserving the history of that night, serving both as testimony and as warnings about the dangers of power unrestrained and the consequences of racialized violence. The lack of justice for the victims compounded the tragedy, underscoring the persistence of structural inequities and the challenge of achieving accountability in a society where systemic bias often protected those in positions of authority, while those most vulnerable bore the consequences. The Jackson State shootings thus stand as a stark reminder of how quickly safety and normalcy can be shattered when power is exercised without oversight, and how the physical and psychological scars of such events extend far beyond the immediate moment of violence. The dormitories, once symbols of learning and community, became emblems of vulnerability and resilience, testifying to both the perils faced by marginalized communities and the courage displayed in the face of life-threatening adversity. The legacy of that night continues to resonate in contemporary discussions about civil rights, police accountability, and the ongoing struggle for justice. As historians, activists, and educators reflect upon the profound implications of what transpired on May 15, 1970, in remembering the trauma suffered and the absence of accountability, the story of Jackson State University serves as both a historical record and a cautionary tale, illustrating the enduring need for vigilance, empathy, and the protection of human dignity in the pursuit of a more just society. The events of May 15, 1970, at Jackson State University cannot be understood simply as an isolated incident of campus unrest. They were deeply embedded within the broader context of systemic racism, entrenched social hierarchies, and the persistent threat of state-sanctioned violence that African American communities endured daily. And the massacre revealed with stark clarity the precarious existence of young black students striving for education and self-determination in a society that, too, often saw them as expendable or threatening. The violence that erupted on that night, following days of escalating tensions fueled by verbal harassment, physical intimidation, and the constant reminder of the nation's inequities, underscored the dangerous intersection of race, authority, and social unrest, showing that the mere act of occupying space in pursuit of learning or protest could provoke lethal consequences. As the students organized, marched, and voiced their demands for justice, equality, and the right to live without fear, they were not merely engaged in routine expressions of dissent. They were asserting their humanity against a backdrop of a legal and cultural system that had historically denied them protection and opportunity. And every confrontation on the streets, every shouted insult, and every retaliatory act against aggressors was imbued with significance, representing both resistance and survival. The systemic nature of the danger became painfully evident when local and state police opened fire on students, unleashing hundreds of rounds with little regard for the lives in their path. And the dormitories, the very structures meant to provide refuge, were transformed into zones of terror, riddled with bullets and echoing with cries of fear and confusion. In these moments, the institutionalized inequities that had shaped the students' everyday lives crystallized into immediate, tangible threats, as the invisible mechanisms of prejudice and oppression manifested as tangible acts of violence. Students who had gathered peacefully, or engaged in acts of protest that were considered minor at worst, found themselves suddenly in a life or death struggle. And the experience of being hunted within one's own campus reinforced the insidious power of systemic racism, not only in its direct actions, but also in the structures and policies that allowed such unchecked authority to operate without accountability. the physical destruction of the dormitories, the injuries inflicted upon young bodies, and the psychological trauma that spread through the campus were stark reminders that racism was not only social or cultural but also mechanized and enforceable through violence, illustrating the multiple dimensions through which oppression operated. Beyond the immediate horror of gunfire and destruction, the incident illuminated the broader societal conditions that made such violence possible, revealing the endemic nature of police brutality and the complicity of institutions that either condoned or failed to prevent it. The fact that no officers were held accountable, despite clear evidence of indiscriminate force, highlighted the structural barriers to justice and the ways in which authority could operate with impunity, reinforcing the broader narrative of African American vulnerability in a nation struggling with racial inequities. This lack of accountability was not merely procedural but symbolic, demonstrating to both students and the wider community that the lives of Black Americans could be jeopardized with minimal consequence to those in power. And the psychological toll of this realization compounded the trauma, embedding a sense of insecurity and mistrust that extended far beyond the immediate survivors. In essence, the Jackson State shootings were not only a failure of law enforcement protocols, but a manifestation of societal failures that allowed systemic oppression to escalate into lethal consequences. The dangers faced by African American students during this period were both overt and subtle, ranging from the threat of physical violence in the streets and on campus to the insidious pressures of daily discrimination, harassment, and exclusion. The students' activism, which encompassed calls for racial equality, resistance to harassment, and opposition to the ongoing Vietnam War, positioned them at a nexus of multiple forms of societal tension, and their courage in organizing and speaking out reflected both moral clarity and profound risk awareness. In navigating these threats, they had to balance the imperative of advocacy with the ever-present risk that their efforts could provoke violent reprisal. And the reality of that night, when law enforcement transformed the campus into a battlefield, revealed the ultimate stakes of this precarious existence. Every protest, every act of defiance, and every attempt to assert agency was shadowed by the historical context of systemic racism, demonstrating that the struggle for civil rights and personal safety was inseparable from the broader social and political currents of the era. In recounting the Jackson State shootings, it becomes evident that the events were more than a tragic episode. They were a crystallization of systemic failures, an exposé of the lethal potential inherent in unchecked authority, and a lens through which to understand the persistent dangers confronting African American students. The dormitories, riddled with bullets and scarred by violence, became tangible symbols of vulnerability and resilience, while the psychological wounds borne by survivors illustrated the deep and lasting impact of structural injustice. This night, marked by indiscriminate gunfire, trauma, and the absence of accountability, underscores the reality that for African American students in the United States during this period, the pursuit of education, justice, and equality was inseparable from the navigation of existential threats, and that the struggle for civil rights was not merely a moral or political endeavor, but a matter of survival. The Jackson State tragedy thus serves as both historical record and enduring lesson, demonstrating the intersection of systemic racism, police brutality, and the ongoing fight for dignity and security, reminding us that vigilance, empathy, and sustained activism are essential to ensuring that the lessons of the past inform a safer and more equitable future for all communities. As we reflect on the tragic events of May 15, 1970, at Jackson State University, it becomes clear that this moment in history transcends a single night of violence. It represents a profound chapter in the ongoing struggle for justice, equality, and recognition of the humanity of African American communities in the United States. Jackson State University, a historically Black institution, has long been more than a place of learning. It has been a hub of activism, a space where young minds are encouraged to challenge injustice, and a sanctuary for resilience in the face of systemic oppression. The courage displayed by the students on that fateful night, standing up against harassment, segregation, and violence, is a testament to the enduring spirit of activism that has defined the university for generations. Their voices, their bravery, and, tragically, their sacrifices continue to resonate, reminding us that the fight for civil rights and equality has always demanded both moral conviction and immense personal courage. The shootings left an indelible mark on the campus and the wider community, a painful reminder of how power can be wielded without accountability and how systemic racism can manifest in ways both overt and insidious. Yet, from this tragedy, Jackson State University emerged as a symbol of resistance, teaching future generations the importance of standing firm in the pursuit of justice while remaining committed to education, dialogue, and community building. The scars in the dormitories, the stories of students who survived, and the memories of those lost serve as living history, ensuring that the lessons of May 1970 are neither forgotten nor minimized. These narratives compel us to reflect on the balance between civic activism and safety, the responsibilities of those in power, and the necessity of confronting injustice wherever it arises. Over the years, the legacy of Jackson State University has been intertwined with the broader history of the civil rights movement, showing that change is often born from both struggle and sacrifice. The courage of students who challenged discriminatory practices, demanded accountability, and voiced opposition to the Vietnam War exemplifies the intersection of social justice movements, where the fight for racial equality and opposition to militarized aggression converge in a shared commitment to human dignity. By remembering the events of that night, we honor not only the lives lost and forever altered but also the ongoing work of educators, activists, and students who continue to advance the cause of justice, turning pain into purpose and adversity into advocacy. Jackson State University today stands as a beacon of Black excellence and resilience. It reminds us that institutions are shaped not only by their buildings or their academic programs, but by the people who inhabit them and the values they uphold. The stories from May 15, 1970, remind us that education is inseparable from social consciousness, and that learning within a historically marginalized community carries the dual responsibility of academic achievement and societal awareness. Students who walk the campus today inherit this legacy, learning that their voices matter, their actions can create change, and their courage has historical precedent. They are called to engage not only with textbooks and lectures, but also with the history and lived experiences of those who came before them, understanding that progress is built on both knowledge and moral fortitude. As we close this reflection, it is essential to recognize that the events at Jackson State University serve as both a cautionary tale and an inspiration. They reveal the dangers of unchecked authority, the consequences of systemic inequities, and the urgent need for vigilance in protecting the rights of marginalized communities. At the same time, they celebrate the resilience, determination, and unwavering courage of students who refuse to be silenced, whose actions remind us that meaningful change requires both boldness and perseverance. In honoring their legacy, we reaffirm our commitment to advocating for justice, supporting educational institutions as spaces of safety and empowerment, and remembering the human stories behind historical events. Thank you so much for taking the time to watch and engage with this important story. Your support helps us continue to shine a light on histories that must not be forgotten. If you found this video meaningful, please like, subscribe, and share it with others so that more people can learn from these lessons of courage, resilience, and the ongoing struggle for justice. By keeping these narratives alive, we ensure that the sacrifices of those students continue to inspire future generations to stand for what is right, to educate themselves and others, and to contribute to a world where equality and justice are not ideals but lived realities. Good night, and may you rest well knowing that history, memory, and the fight for justice continue in each of us.